Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. I'm your host today, Valentino Stoll. We're joined by a very special guest today, Brad Gessler. Brad, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit why you're famous.
Yeah, I've never thought about why I'm famous. So I'll shoot off the cuff here. My background with Rails. I was formerly the CTO of Pull Everywhere. Wrote the first lines of code in a Rails application. And I spent about 12, maybe 13 years writing kind of the first lines of code for that, and then moving more into a management position, which I wanted to get back into coding, which is what I'm doing now. So right now I'm pretty much get to write articles about Ruby on Rails, try a few of these ideas that I have, which you can read about on the fly.io/Ruby dispatch, and just write about it and share it with the world and hopefully make Rails a better place.
That's awesome. I haven't actually had a chance to play with fly.io yet. I have heard a lot of hype around it.
Yeah.
Did you see it before you joined fly.io, or did you already know about it before you joined?
I kind of knew about it. I've known Kurt. He's the CEO of Fly for a while. And when I left Pull Everywhere, I had no anticipation of like getting a job right away. But then Kurt said, "Hey, we're looking for a Ruby specialist, a Rails specialist." And at the time, I was also thinking, you know what? I'm getting tired of using Heroku. Like things are just kind of old. Where's HTTP2? So I kind of got nerd sniped by Kurt into this, and it's like, oh, I can play with Rails and help build the future cloud for Rails, as I like to think about it. So that's what got my attention, and I'm like, okay, this seems like something that would be fun to do for a while. So now, again, I get to think about how could Rails be better and actually try those ideas, which we saw with some of the Docker work. My colleague Sam Ruby worked on that. So you can generate a Docker file for Rails now, which should improve deployments for Rails apps dramatically. And more recently, I've been working on just component-driven view architecture. So it's been a lot of fun to be able to just ask myself questions like, hey, what if I just built a Rails application that did not use any herb, templates, layouts, none of that. It was just built entirely of components. And I've got to like dive into the Rails source code and kind of see what's going on and write about some interesting things.
Yeah, I have so many questions about this. I have, I'm probably not alone. We talked off, before the show about this. But Rails out of the box, user interface, which I guess is like purposely lacking, but it's still, there's nothing definitive for like getting quickly started, right, with a front end. It's kind of like, okay, here's a ton of other frameworks you can snap in place, and that's kind of been the new approach with all the front end tooling, right, with JS bundling and all that. They all have great ways to get interfaces set up quickly. But there's nothing, built in or native. And I kind of liked, your article, and I've been following along kind of your trek here on componentizing, these little interface components. Because it is like something you do every time, right? Like you get to this point in your application where you've done all the CRUD stuff and you're trying to add some interaction, and do I install React at this point? Like, is that necessary, right? Can I use Hotwire? And at that point, like, well, how easy is it to start managing my interface elements like systematically, right?
Yeah.
It's not there.
Yeah, it starts to get out of hand. It seems like Rails does have some things out of the box. So you can generate scaffoldings. And some of the SaaS starter kits have that too. There's like Bullet Train has super scaffolding. So there are some kind of point solutions out there that can solve those problems. But for the most part, what's really kind of driving my desire for this component-driven architecture, part of it is just more rapid prototyping. But I also just want to move away from generating files to solve these problems. If you build your application entirely with all these generated files, then to your point, if you have to go and change something, you're just going through all these different files and finding this markup that you have to like change. So, you know, you need to get really good at regex and just learn that and know how to like search through all these files and grep and replace things. Um, you there may be a future where like GPT-5 or whatever could just go in and figure it all out, which is kind of the wild card. But the thing that I'm focusing on now is like, how can we have something that's more declarative, where you could just say, "Hey, I want to render this form. I want all my forms in my application to look the same. Could I just drop a form component here, give it a model, and say, hey, I want to show these fields?" And there are some libraries that do that. Like I think Simple Form comes to mind. But the
Yep.
last time I used Simple Form, I remember editing the markup for what's emitted. It had to be done in a configuration file. So you have to like
Yeah.
shut down the
It's
Ruby
pretty painful.
server, yeah, and reboot the whole stack. And what's interesting is I basically rebuilt the Rails form helper from the ground up using Phlex. A lot of the work that I'm doing is based on Phlex, which we can get to in a moment. But I found in rewriting a lot of the Rails form helpers, there's a lot that's not going right in Rails form helpers that makes it kind of awkward to use. And I can see some improvements, especially when it comes to like displaying errors and integrating with HTML5 client side validations. There's so much that can be done with a componentized architecture towards building this stuff. Um, and I think a lot of that comes from just, it's a lot easier whenever you're dealing with data inside of Ruby code, and they're just much closer together. And you don't have that whenever you're dealing with like partials and templates and all that. It's kind of like, okay, my view files are all the way over here in the views directory, and my data and all this stuff is kind of jammed into these models and all these other things. Maybe they control it, but
Right.
it's just kind of spread out. It's hard to reason through like the state of a view and the data that a view has associated with it. So you do end up with all these crazy kind of duct tape and baling wire type situations. And we even see that with Turbo. Like Turbo's pretty good, but you're still essentially finding DOM IDs on a page, and you're kind of patching based on that. And I think a potential future I see with components is in Rails, we could have something that looks more like live view, where you just worry less about kind of matching DOM ID with DOM ID, and it just becomes more declarative. And you kind of have these things that mostly just work and mostly stay in sync with the server. I haven't gotten that far yet, where I'm like, okay, now it's time to wire Turbo or Hotwire into the components. But it's fully compatible. You can call out to all the Turbo helpers and all that stuff from components. So I don't see a reason why it can't be done. In fact, I know Joel Draper. He's the creator of Phlex. He's been working with the creator of the Falcon server. I don't know why I can't remember his name offhand, but I think
Oh,
they're
Samuel
working on
Williams.
that's it. Yeah. So they put together this proof of concept where the view can start rendering from the component. It puts this placeholder on the client side markup while the async query is running, and then when the async query is complete, then it populates the rest of that view. So there's,
Live view.
yeah, similar. We don't Rails doesn't have the Beam runtime, so there's the question of how do you
Yeah.
manage that, the client side
I worry about that a lot.
state. Yeah, it might not be a big deal though. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I haven't thought about it enough to know if it is. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, that's fair.
it'll be interesting to see if it's possible, and it is. It's a question is like, what does that look like? It's probably built on Redis or something, right? Like that seems to be the solution for all Rails things. Like just let Redis handle it, and then it's fine.
Yeah, I mean I guess the biggest issue is like that bidirectionality, right? Like you want, it becomes like you can only get past the HTTP handshake for so long before it
Yeah,
starts becoming a bottleneck, especially when you're doing a ton of requests. Uh, so I'm a little worrisome. I know WebSocket is supposed to like help in that regard to,
yeah,
you know, make it go through a single pipeline at least. But I'm not convinced we're quite there yet.
yeah.
uh, But I'm curious what your experience has been so far with using Flex. My experience with like component structure is kind of almost exclusively with view component
Yeah.
um, and partials, right?
Yeah. Flex is kind of a funny journey for me because initially I saw it, I thought, oh, this is a terrible idea. Um, whenever I see something like that, or I have that thought, I think I follow it up with like, okay, but there's probably something interesting going on here. Um, and so I'll just dive into it. And I think it's actually a lot like Tailwind, where initially it seems like a terrible idea, and to some it still is. Like it's very there's strong opinions about it, and I think that's always going to be true for Flex. Like there will be people who just prefer to write herb in HTML Markdown, and that's totally fine. I get there's a lot of reasons why you would want to do that, be it technical reasons or team reasons. But I will say that initially, if you look at Flex and you think like, oh, this is weird, it seems like a terrible idea. If you start using it and kind of get past that initial level of discomfort, um, you'll you'll start to like it a lot more. Especially whenever you realize like, oh wow, I can take this view component and I can extract this thing into its own component and then put a method called like table or something or data grid within one of my views, and then it just kind of works. So you will get to a point if you use it enough where you're almost kind of building your own like higher level markup language inside of these Flex components, and that's whenever, at least for me, I realized like, wow, there's something to this where you could just very rapidly build um, applications. And I think it would start off kind of slow, where oh geez, there's this initial like, what are the components that I need for my application? But once you kind of get past that initial setup of your components and you figure that out, that's where things just get a lot faster, and it's just very quick to put views together using Flex. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's pretty cool. So I
there's
mean,
still a lot of work in the docs that need to be done to
okay,
to lay that out in a much better way. I'm not even sure if what I said makes sense, but I think there's something to that journey of you're putting a bunch of components together. The next level is kind of when you realize how you can move those things out and essentially build your own like DSL. I know that can be a dirty word, but um, not even in that way. I didn't even mean it that way. I mean, domain specific languages in Ruby are frowned upon sometimes, but um, the way that Flex does it and the way that it kind of evolves is just very nice.
yeah, I know what you mean. There there are so many gems that start with like their domain specific language, right? And they're like,
Yeah,
"Oh, look how great it is." And then you start having your edge cases and you're like, "Well, how do I get around these edge cases?" And it's using their, DSL, it becomes very hard to
yeah,
extend
yeah,
without like modifying the internals, right?
yeah.
So I was curious if you like ran into a lot of that or if it was pretty much all there and
Oh
any edge
yeah,
case you could get around a different way.
yeah. I like to say if you're not running into leaky abstractions, you're probably in denial. And whenever I'm working on a framework, I do think that's very important. Like you need to build the thing with an understanding that there's abstractions leak, and you should always have an escape hatch for whenever the end user, the developer, runs into that. So that's something that Flex does pretty well. Um,
Okay.
like for example, we all know that the title, we all know of the title element in HTML documents. So there's a method inside of Flex called title. And if you call that, it wants to generate a title tag. But if you want to make a view component, say for a blog post, you might have title in there and you would call the title method. So you have this like conflicting namespace issue. But if you look inside of Flex, you can call title tag, or you can register that element and kind of get around that. So there's plenty of escape hatches in Flex, where if you run into some of these abstraction issues, you can always drop a level below that, get out of whatever trouble spot you're in, and then it's kind of off to the races. And I think this is true for all abstractions. Like when you hit those parts where they leak, it does take some time. You have to break your flow and working in your current level of abstraction and say, oh, okay, now I have to like go the next level below that, figure out how to get out of whatever conflict or abstraction leak I'm in. And then once you figure that out, if you run into it again, then it's not a big deal. So there is a bit of a learning curve. And I think, again, that's true for any abstractions. But the question is that learning curve worth it? And can you be more productive using the abstractions? And again, when you run out of trouble, like how do you get out of that trouble? So that's all there in Phlex. And the stuff that I'm working on and the way that I work and solve these problems and release gems, I think a lot about that. Running into the leaks, fixing the leaks, and getting back on the saddle.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think back to Slim, right?
Yeah.
Which for those that don't know is like kind of like the slimmed down version of ERB.
Yeah.
And it tries to follow more along the lines of the DOM with just class structure with minimized notation.
Yeah.
Uh which I know a lot of designers like and front end people, so
Yeah.
it definitely has stuck around quite a long time. So I'm wondering if you have like had any experience like working directly with like front end specific people, and
Yeah.
what if you have what their experience is working with Flex.
I haven't yet. I
Okay.
all I can go off of is reactions I've seen on Twitter, which, like, always take it with a grain of salt, and I guess
Right.
some community posts. But it doesn't surprise me. I think it's similar to Slim and Haml, which, if people haven't heard of Haml, it's very similar to Slim, using a slightly different notation, but it's pretty much the same. People are just very opinionated about it, and I assume that's going to be true for components. Um, so I've used Haml and Slim. I still use it to this day. I love abstractions on top of markup, because if I don't have that, I'm going to forget to close a tag, and then I have to chase that down. So I look at these abstractions as these things are actually preventing me from shipping many bugs to production. That's how I look at it. But I totally get and understand how front end designers who are familiar with working with HTML and CSS and JavaScript directly, they're probably not going to like this as much, because it will feel a little bit different. And they'll probably run into some problems with, like, assembling a paragraph in this thing. What if you have a paragraph with some text, and then you need to have some bold font in there, and you have to put a tag in there? But that said, I don't think it's necessary to just have all Flex. I actually still think markup has areas where it is just better. A lot of that, I think, is in content. Like, if you ask me to write kind of a semi-formatted essay or something, or some documentation, I would want to reach towards Markdown, assuming that kind of the notation there is enough for the problems that I'm trying to solve. But if that's not enough, if I need some fancier stuff in there, like, I don't know, embedded maps or some crazier HTML, I would have no problem reaching for ERB or any of those templating languages. And you could actually still use that with Flex and render it from Flex. So if you build kind of the application side of your Rails app using Flex components, I think that's where it really shines. But if you're building more of a content site, I still think you can have Flex to manage the layout and some of the navigation and stuff, and it's going to help a lot. But I would say, like, create your content in ERB or Markdown, or any of these other kind of markup languages. It just makes more sense where we have long form docs to do it that way. So I also think, like, a really good component front end for Rails is really important. And I also think a good kind of file-based content management system is just as important for Rails. And that's another project I've been working on, is SitePress for several years, which is essentially, I was using Middleman for a while, loved Middleman. It was great. I tried to embed it into Rails because I needed that kind of level of content management in a Rails app. And of course, Middleman wouldn't embed in there because it has a ton of gem dependencies. So I built SitePress, which is essentially a copy of Middleman, except you can plug it into Rails, or you can run it standalone and compile a static website. Um, but the nice thing about kind of components and middle or not middleman and Cypress coming together is it's very easy to create content. If you want to add a blog or like support documentation, it's as easy as it was to create a web page like 15 years ago in Dreamweaver. You just like create a support folder and start throwing documents in there and like upload that. Same idea. You're just like creating files, throw it in your Rails app, um, and you have like great documentation. And then for the kind of application side of the house, you should be using components. At least that's my opinion.
That's really cool. I like the idea. I mean, I think about even just like the whole Jekyll idea, right? Where you're just like, okay, there is some initial setup
Yeah,
for the layout and whatnot, right? But if you take it outside of that, like new content is just creating a file and uploading it, right? And then it just like works.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, and I mean, there's a lot of static site generators now in
yeah. There's
Rails.
a ton.
I'm thinking Bridgetown.
Yeah,
Middleman was definitely one I was familiar with back in the day, and it worked great.
yeah,
For what it did. I didn't honestly do too much with it. I
yeah,
didn't I didn't hit those limits like you mentioned earlier, right,
yeah.
with a new tool. But Cypress is pretty cool here. What got you into this?
So my last company,
Well, before hold on.
yeah,
Before
yeah,
we get there, because I
yeah,
had questions about the componentized portion
yeah.
uh,
You
of
go back to that.
of Flex, right? Because
Yeah, yeah,
I think about like the ideal component view structure. It makes me think about design systems, right? Like
yeah,
the I'll never forget. I saw this guy. Oh man, I'm blanking on his name. Uh, but he was known for like he did the Atom, if you've ever seen that, the Atom project,
yeah,
where all the elements were like tiny little pieces that built into your bigger mass, right?
yeah,
And it kind of like turned into the design system,
yeah.
idea, right?
The atomic
Uh,
design system, right?
yep, the atomic design
Yeah.
system,
The
and
the name
uh, I forget his last name. I think it's Brad too.
I want to
uh,
say it's the last name is Frost, but I don't know if I'm remembering. Oh, Brad Frost. Yeah.
Brad Frost. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, he has an actually a really great talk called "Fuck the Bullshit," which if you've ever been frustrated with anybody's user interface, like on any site, like he just goes and through like all the bad things people do and why you shouldn't do
Yeah.
it and why do we do it, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, like I think about a design system as like being like the crux of like where you want to head with an application for like
Yeah.
front end, right? Like because
Yeah.
having it all managed like that, where everything is kind of like normalized to compartmentalized pieces of whatever your application is doing,
Yeah.
that you can reuse these components everywhere. It makes so much sense,
Yeah.
and it allows the separation of designers and code, but also blends them, right? Like there's
Yeah.
so many great benefits of having that. Um, and so I was excited about Vue components, right? Which is kind of
Yeah.
like they GitHub basically, took all of their we have a design system and like made this new thing so that they could make it easier to reuse those components into like specific,
Yeah.
pieces of code and design. And so it makes a lot of sense to me, and it makes me think too. You were mentioning Vue, right? Their component structure, I just really love.
Yeah.
I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm talking about Vue.js. And it just the encapsulation of the front end is just like it makes it so easy to reuse, and it's straightforward, and what you
Yeah.
need to change and alterate, right, the
Yeah.
properties of those specific things. And so Flex was very promising to me because it gave me that same kind of idea of, oh, like, okay, these reusable components that is in a Rails context, I could use Ruby everywhere.
Yeah.
uh you know and not that Vue component isn't also like that, but it blurs the lines a little bit more, right? Where it's like,
Yeah.
all right, well, you can also use HTML, like you can still use all these other things, right?
Yeah.
uh which really, it's pick your poison.
Yeah.
To be honest, there's not one better than the other.
Yeah.
But I think organizing and getting things into that design system mentality, I think
Yeah.
is probably the most important. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on like how Flex works on building that idea.
Yeah.
How easy is that to do? And like maybe other things that you've seen that maybe are worked easier or better, or maybe worked differently than you expected.
Yeah. So this is something that I also think about a lot with Flex and even View Component. I think View Component is a great library. I've used it in some projects. Um, what's interesting about it compared to Flex, though, is in View Component, uh, slots are this kind of special thing that you have to think about. And with Flex, what's really interesting about Flex is a slot is just a block that opens up a ton of possibilities. I won't try to articulate it because it's kind of hard to articulate it, but you can just make it's easier to make certain things. Like for me to rebuild the Rails form helper, it's just much easier if I don't have to think about slots versus markup. Like those are essentially the same thing, but in Flex they are the same thing. It's just a block. It's just code, so you can mix the two and do some pretty interesting things. Um, but aside from that, I think like with respect to design systems, what's really important is if you're building a component library, I think what's important there is that you can support a very iterative approach. And what I mean by that is it's one thing to ship a library, but you need to think about how are developers and designers going to work together to kind of evolve the design system. It's not going to happen at once. It's going to happen as a back and forth over time. And that interaction is important to think about. So when I put the view component um, kind of proof of concept together, one thing you'll notice is that I decided to support these inline controller views, which is kind of crazy. Like, who wants to put their view code inside of a controller? Um, the reason for that, though, is whenever I start building a web application, I always think I would love to just build it in Sinatra this time. It's just so easy to it feels lightweight and all those kind of things. But I've had enough experience with Sinatra apps where it feels great starting out. It feels very productive, but then I just end up rebuilding some version of Rails that is not as good as Rails. It's just
Oh,
kind
that
of a
is so
mess.
true.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe it's not a mess for me, but if another developer comes in, they're just like, "Whoa, what's going on here? Where are my models?" So I've learned the hard way that um, Rails like has its benefits there, and then other people can come in and they kind of know where to look for things. So whenever I set out on this, I also thought, how can I bring that kind of initial prototyping experience that feels so good in Sinatra? How can I bring that into Rails? And that's what inspired me to support this idea of like you can create a show class nested inside of a say posts controller, and that's going to map to the resources show route, and it's just going to like render that component. So you get that kind of benefit of wow, I can just prototype the view inside of the controller and have that Sinatra like prototyping experience. And then when I'm kind of done with the prototype, I can move that view out of the controller and I can move it into the views folder, um, or just wherever. It's just a class, so you can just kind of put it wherever. And I also think that
That's
kind
really
of
cool.
I think that approach matters. I explain that in a way that matters to the developer, but I think like that line of thinking for shipping a good component library is going to be important for like how do designers um, engage with kind of this process. So I don't know. Maybe if there's some designers listening to this and they have some ideas for what that looks like, get a hold of me. And I would like to hear more about that and understand just more about how that works to figure out what what could be done for an eventual library that I will ship um, to make the life of designers easier. But all that I think is very important. Not just what does this library do, or what are its APIs, but how is it used over time, and is it can you ship something where people can evolve things and without having to boil the ocean all at once? That's
Yeah,
that's been my experience with
I get
design
that.
teams too. Like you can't design the design system all at once. You can, but you're going to throw a lot of it away.
Yeah, I mean, from my personal experience, the biggest issues are getting shareability across applications, right? When you
Yeah,
start, because once you get big enough with your monolith, you start creating other apps just because it's better to have it the encapsulation, and you don't even need the data in a lot of contexts in the same application. And so you start shooting off all these other applications, but you still want the same look,
yeah,
right? And so like how do you get those same, you know, components like shared across those applications?
yeah,
And then and it's weird because each of those has its own interaction, potentially. So like you kind of need to support JavaScript at that point. So like how do
yeah,
you blend the two
yeah,
also and share it? Um, and it becomes very cumbersome to manage that on a big
yeah,
scale. Uh, and I think that's probably why it does no great solution exists
yeah. I
because
think there's
of how hard it is. So,
I think there's two reasons for that.
okay.
Um, Flex solves one of those problems. The other is the asset pipeline. So I'll start with the first part. Since Flex is entirely Ruby code, it's way easier to package that up into a gem and ship that. You don't have to worry about creating a Rails engine. You don't have to worry about telling that engine like, here's where my template and view files are for this plugin. Um, Even if you get past that, though, you still we see this in third party libraries like um, it's not Omnioth. What's the other one? Devise, where if you want to customize the login screen, you have to like type in this command, and again, it generates these view
Yeah.
files and it throws
Generates the
them.
new copy.
Yeah, and it just throws these view files in your project that look nothing at all like what you want them to look like. So you have to like essentially change those files and rewrite them. If you're lucky, you just
Yeah.
tweak
I
a few
mean,
things, but usually it's a
even if
rewrite.
you had like Simple Form used to have a plugin where you could extend
Yeah,
it, right? Where it would at least generate in your overall hierarchy of like how to generate a form, but even
yeah.
still,
So my hope is that Flex is used to kind of ship we'll call it like a standard library of components. I think a lot of that would be calling into Rails helpers. The Rails form helper needs to be rewritten. I'm convinced of that. Not a huge rewrite, and it would work the same. Um, but the reason I think that's important is because I figured out a way where you can just create a form and a component, and then that form component will tell the controller which attributes to permit. So think about how many times you've built a Rails app and you forget to permit an attribute. You're testing it in the browser, like, why won't this save? Forgot to permit
it's
an attribute. Um,
every time.
yeah, so I think there's like forms are a problem that we all deal with. We all we want kind of form errors to be handled, I think mostly in a consistent way, but how they're displayed that's where things vary. And I think Flex can provide base classes for these things that are going to be easy for people to just like add the base Flex gem to your application, this like standard library components, and then just extend it. And then you could probably actually use refinements in the way they were meant to be used and say like refine all of the form objects in my Rails application with this subclass that I extended from this thing. So whenever I render a form, I want it to use my subclass that's specialized for Rails. And in theory, you could do that and we just update all the forms in your applications without having to like go through all these files and change a bunch of stuff. So that's kind of one thing I look forward to. All right, but to get to the second point, like why is it so hard to ship JavaScript with a with like a Rails plugin that you want to write? And I wrote about this too on Ruby Dispatch on Fly.io. The asset pipeline is it's a mess. Um, I think the official way now, the docs were recently cleaned up and it basically says use import maps and use sprockets. That's kind of like the official way of going about it. But what frustrates me about that, I think I like that we want to get there, but what happens whenever you need to bring in a package, say from Node or from one of these gems, that's where things get really confusing. Um, how are you importing these JavaScript things from plugins? It's not clear. The documentation isn't that great. And then there's a bunch of different kind of asset pipelines that Rails actually has. There's JS bundling. There's import maps. You can use Webpacker still if you want, even though that's officially deprecated. Um, if you do start a Rails application with import maps and you need to use Node for some reason, there's no great path to get there. There's no script that you run that say like upgrades from import maps to JS bundling. CSS is kind of similar. There's like there's even more of those. I think there's Dart, Saz, Tailwind. I think Webpacker can handle CSS too, and it's just not clear. Like, okay, what do I use? Um, so yeah, I wrote an article about that so I could understand it myself, and I think I answered some questions, but I had some more questions like, why is the asset pipeline this crazy? And it's still that way. So I don't have a great answer for how JavaScript assets can be bundled in a clean way with Phlex components, and then integrated with whatever pipeline, whatever asset pipeline the Rails application that needs to use it is running. I don't like. I hope the Rails community gets to a point where it's like, yes, this is the one way or maybe two ways of doing it, and makes that much clearer for people who build Rails plugins, so that we can distribute JavaScript assets in a sane way with Rails apps. I guess today you would have to like publish your JS package to Node or something if you're creating a Rails plugin. I don't really know. I try to just avoid distributing JavaScript with Rails plugins, which I think is kind of a shame.
I remember what was it, Rails assets,
Yeah,
right? Where you used to have the gems that you could then include, and it would bundle it with the the Node app
yeah,
pipeline, which was a little messy, but it worked.
yeah,
It did work, and it plugged right in the asset
yeah,
pipeline, right? Like it did solve some of the problems, maybe including way too much JavaScript upfront, right?
yeah. I kind of now I find myself missing sprockets, even though at the time I knew I was running into all these problems using sprockets as the JavaScript pipeline. But it was the thing it had going for it is everybody distributed Rails plugins that knew if they needed to serve up assets that it would be integrating with sprockets. Um, so we kind of lost that. Now it's just there's a bunch of different asset pipelines for different reasons, which actually is very unrailsy when I think about it. Like Rails is supposed to have this opinion, and at least for the past few years, there's been kind of this very lightweight opinion of like, let's use import maps. But there's just been so many other options where it's been kind of a mess. So I don't know,
Yeah,
we'll
I
see
mean,
how it evolves.
I'm hopeful. I mean, it's been a year almost, right, since
Yeah,
since that kind of came out, and it's not really that much better, to be honest. It's
yeah,
still a which one do you use kind of thing.
yeah, yeah. Now there's prop
But
shaft.
the
What do we
prop
do with prop
shaft,
shaft? Yeah,
right? Yeah, what is that?
yeah. It's supposed to replace sprockets, but like,
Right.
okay, should we use prop shaft for new projects? Maybe, maybe not. It's still unclear. And then it's like,
Yeah.
I want to distribute a plugin. Do I integrate with prop shaft? Do I distribute a node package or integrate with sprockets? So it's pretty bonkers. Um, and it doesn't, I think it's harming kind of the plugin ecosystem around just like Vue type plugins. And like I said, going back to the 2 points, like I think Phlex will solve the problem of how do I distribute um, components in a sane way in Rails, um,
Yeah.
in a way that can be like overridden and extended and all that stuff with kind of OO principles. But it doesn't solve the asset problem, and it persists, and it will until there's a strong opinion that says something like, you got to use prop shaft, and if you want to distribute a plugin, like distribute it, distribute your JavaScript over Node or npm. So yeah, we'll
Yeah,
see
I
where
mean,
that
it's
goes.
still yeah, it's still that too, from a user interface perspective, right? Like front end wise, performance, like do you want to wait for the entire page to render all the individual things that that
Yeah.
you want to wait for the user to do, right? And say, okay, load the page as fast as possible, and then just like let the user see stuff is loading, right? Or do you
Yeah.
want to just like wait for the page to load with all the stuff already there,
Yeah.
right? And like both go different directions as far as asset management,
Yeah.
right? And both like have the problem of are we including too much of the assets at once?
Yeah.
And then are we duplicating assets? And caching kind of resolves the duplicates, right?
Yeah.
Or could if
Yeah.
caching were easy.
It's amazing how difficult it is to like efficiently serve up assets. And
It's,
it's not just one discipline either. It's like you have to understand HTTP, networking, like all these factors to understand just how to serve up some JavaScript quickly.
so I'm curious, have you seen anything out there that seems promising as far as managing assets in this way?
Not really. I've had some like I would describe them as like fantasies of forget it. Let's just throw everything in a public directory and we'll deploy it to Fly.io and just don't worry about fingerprinting and all that stuff. Just like get the assets closer to users, which Fly, you can do that. You can type in Fly deploy and it'll just deploy your application out to like 10 servers around the world.
Oh, that's
But
cool.
it'd be cool to like do that, just throw everything in public and, maybe every request, it maybe has a short TTL and then it's checking e tags um, every 5 minutes or something. Like, wow, wouldn't that be so much easier to do it that way? I haven't dove into that yet. Um, it almost seems like a joke, but that also tells me there's probably something to that. If you're shipping something that seems ironic, like fate loves irony, so chase that down. You probably like will have found something that
Next
people
time
are
we'll have you
adorable.
on and you'll have solved the asset problem for us.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I think Fly might solve it on that front, but I don't know. There's not really a great conceptual way of doing it without fingerprinting. Um,
Yeah, that you make a good point about like deployments and like all these hosting providers,
yeah,
hosting all the same stuff. Uh it's a little surprising that they haven't just been like, okay, we're gonna host all the popular ones, right? Like we're already serving it, right? Like why not us
yeah,
cache it and save money?
yeah. That's interesting. I didn't think of it that way, but yeah, like why not if you're running a major hosting provider, like hey, use our node. Um, I keep calling it node. Use our npm CDN.
Right.
And if you're hosting here, like just tap into that, and it's all there next to your server. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I would use a hosting provider that did that.
yeah, that's a pretty good idea. I
uh
think there's like
but
there's third
anyway,
party ones that you're not paying money directly to them. You're like, how do they make money? But
right. Yeah.
if it's your own hosting provider, you'd be like, all right, if they start screwing with these assets, then like I'm just gonna leave.
Yeah,
But
that's true.
it'd be interesting to combine the two. I'm sure Cloudflare does that. Like they run so much of the internet. They're probably kind of doing it behind the scenes, but
Yeah. Cloudflare is pretty great.
yeah,
I use them for some static stuff and zero problems. Their
yeah,
caching is so fast.
yeah,
Um, so back to the site press
yeah.
because I do
Content.
want to touch. I do want to touch on the content portion of it
Yeah,
because I'm always moving my blog to
yeah,
different
yeah,
things. It originally started as a Sinatra app.
yeah,
And then I got tired of updating tweaks to it when I wanted to add a new kind of content or media, or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Uh, and I think I ended up on Ghost, which
yeah.
is completely not Ruby, and I feel ashamed having it a
It's
little
fine.
bit.
It's all right to dabble in
uh,
other languages.
yeah, just try some out.
Yeah,
But the whole Hugo thing seems really interesting, and
yeah,
there's so many toolings built around that, and I mean, really, I look at that and see, like, if you just have content,
yeah,
why have anything dynamic generating it?
yeah,
It so, what got you to want to build your own? I'm curious
yeah.
what that flip was with Middleman, where you're like, all right, that's it.
Yeah, so the two things kind of came together. Like I'd started playing with middleman for just kind of personal sites and small sites. I'm like, this is great. Um, this was, I don't know, five or so years ago. And then at Pull Everywhere, we kind of did what usually happens in Rails applications. You're like, oh, I have this big application I shipped. I need to have like a landing page. And at that point, you're not ready to just like go to, you know, build a static site just for this one landing page. So you just kind of build it inside the Rails app, hook it up to the routes. You don't think much about it. And then, you know, a few months later, a few weeks later, you need another page. So you just kind of start collecting these pages up. Maybe you have a content controller. But it just, you start to end up with these pages that are kind of one-offs and they're scattered around the application. So that got annoying. And I'm like, all right, this seems crazy. I searched the internet, found High Voltage, which is a Thoughtbot um, lightweight content management system for Rails. And I'm like, okay, at least this gets everything so that it's in one controller and I can throw it in there and kind of have folders for it. And that I think is an important thing, that um, the URL where you're loading the content maps to some folder somewhere. And that's a problem if you don't have that and you're just kind of winging content management in Rails or using a database. Like you don't have that. So somebody coming in there is like, where does this content live? And you don't want to have them like go on the search where you have to go through a router to find all that. It should just be like, oh, my legal slash privacy thing is in the legal slash privacy folder, all inside the content folder. Um, so I thought that was important, which is that's what High Voltage did. But the thing that it was missing is middleman, or not middleman. It was missing front matter and all these other goodies that middleman had. So what is front matter? It's kind of if you have a markdown file, you can put a title. It's kind of like metadata. You put it at the top of the page, and it's just YAML. Basically at the top of the page, where you say like the title of this is privacy policy, and you can add just whatever kind of semi-structured content in there. And then whenever you render that, you can read that title from the markdown. You can shove that into the HTML title tag. You could display it as an H1 in your template. So I wanted that. There's just some really nice benefits to treating your content as data, so that you can do things like that. Or for a blog post, you may have a bunch of posts and you have a publish at date, and you want to check that date to see if publish at is in the past, then you want to show that. If it's in the future, you don't want to show that. So there's these kind of, I call them semi-static things that you might want to check for before you serve up kind of static-ish content. So I wanted all of that inside of Rails. I tried to just throw middleman core inside of Rails, and it was not working. There was just way too many dependencies on all these libraries, like active support, older versions. It was just kind of a nightmare managing all those dependencies. And I think I tried Jekyll. Bridgetown didn't exist at the time, but the last time I looked at their source, they had a lot going on with dependencies as well, just a ton of dependencies. So one goal for Cypress is like, how can I make just some really core, simple, lightweight content management functionality that would give me most of the features of middleman that I can embed in whatever. It's like I can embed it in Rails, I can embed it in a rack app. And that was kind of the initial go at this thing. It actually wasn't built on top of Rails initially. I just kind of integrated it into Rails. So anyway, I integrated that into the website, and it cleaned up a lot of the content where I was basically able to run middleman inside of a Rails app. And it just made content management so much easier. At that point, it was like, okay, this thing can be 1.0. It's running in production. It's serving up millions of page views. And it's actually working, and it's solving kind of our organizational problems. And I started moving all of my personal websites and all these other websites over to it. But recently, I've had this thought between components and content. To focus on content, when I think about if you are trying to ship a SaaS product and you spin up a Rails application, like the first thing you see is this Rails logo in the version. There's nothing, it doesn't even tell you what to do next. I find that frustrating. It's a missed opportunity. And the way that I think about whenever you boot a Rails application, you should probably see a content page. And there should be some instruction like, hey, um, you should probably, put the name of your product in there and then just start writing about it. Like, that's the thing that you should ship first. Whenever you spin up a Rails application, it should be, here's this product, here's what it does, 2 or 3 features, like write that out and ship that before you even build any features. Like ship that out there. Maybe have a give me your email address and we'll tell you when this thing launches. But in my mind, a good framework in the future, like a very productive framework out of the box, it should ship with that. Your landing page, here's the concept, some supporting points. We'll email you when it's ready. Um, and then you don't really have to understand even how to write applications for that. You should just understand like, oh, there's this markdown file in app content index. I can write about what this thing does and ship that. And that ideally is shipped to a website like in a few hours. And that's your first iteration. I think to like get to ship a Rails application very rapidly like that takes a lot more time. You have to think about, oh, it's a Rails application. Like I have to start building this application right away. It's like, no, you should probably write about it first and see if people even care about it.
Right.
So
That's
I
a good
think
point.
I see like a productive framework of the future should care more about content. Even to the point where it'd be great if you could run a command that would just pull like a privacy policy in terms of service that are kind of standard and reasonable, and like that's just part of the thing that you ship. So content, I think, is a huge opportunity to make a very productive framework of the future. In addition to kind of the like rapid prototyping abilities that I think about, specifically with like how people should be doing it and how the iterations
Uh,
can happen.
yeah, I'm totally with you on that new Rails page.
Yeah.
And I was kind of hopeful from all the latest improvements in the Rails new generator, where they have their
Yeah.
interactive now, where you can interactively select all the different pieces that you want to include
Nice.
in a new Rails application. I
Yeah.
was hoping that would translate right into a view. So
Yeah.
like you land on the Rails and you're like, yeah, what do you want to add anything here? Right? Like
Yeah.
it could be a new page, but it could also be, create a new model, right?
Yeah.
Like, do some of the crud stuff. Okay, well, I'm generating like, I mean, honestly, it could be even like with GPT, right? Where
Yeah.
you can say, okay, like, give me a quick outline of what you're trying to build here. And it would give you some ideas,
Yeah.
potentially even run the generators for those things and get a scaffold, right? Like, it's definitely like this. It's like, okay, now what,
Yeah.
and I like on the new error pages where you see like, run migrations now,
Yeah.
right, where okay,
Yeah.
like you get an error page, oh, like you might want to run migrations. It seems like there's migrations pending, which
Yeah.
why it wouldn't just run them if you're locally, I don't know.
Yeah.
but like little tweaks like that where it is missed real estate and kind of just like frustrating to people that are just starting out too, like,
Yeah.
okay, well, what do I do next,
Yeah.
okay, like I have my new rail site, but like yeah, where do I go from here,
Yeah.
and I like the idea of starting with content, because that used to be the first thing I added to any site, like you were mentioning high voltage. That was
Yeah.
my go-to. I just add it and then open up a markdown,
Yeah.
uh, and start writing something, and I would have it convert to whatever the template was. But
Yeah.
uh,
It'd be nice to have that dopamine hit that fast. It's like, oh, I
right,
made the landing page and shipped it. Um,
right,
it,
done.
it it should almost be like it should almost be it should be so easy that you can impulsively do that after you impulsively buy a domain name. Like, oh, I had the domain. Maybe that's the default, right? It's like enter your domain and then
Enter
the
your
landing.
domain.
Yeah, but it actually says domain for sale that I probably won't use. You just put the price of the thing and it's like, I have this great idea. I'm definitely going to do it. Um,
Right.
and you ship that. And then at least, down the road, somebody like, hey, I see your domain's for sale. You haven't done anything with it for 2 years. Huh. But yeah, it would be great. Like just editing content, way more people can do that. So why not just, when you boot the thing, say like, hey, go over here and write about this thing and ship it.
Right.
And then you have something that's it's public. So there's your endpoint, and then you can just like hopefully rapidly iterate on the view component side of things to actually ship the application. Um, and the prototyping that should be as easy as I'll date myself here by saying it should be as easy as building like a Microsoft Access application. Um, Easier. You should
Oh,
just be
that's
able to say,
funny.
here's a form with these fields. This field's an association. Should just give me a drop down. Like I shouldn't have to write all that out and give it an array. Just figure it out. Um,
Right.
and yeah, there's so much that can be done in the view. It's ridiculous. Um, so we'll see what happens with the view layer. We'll see how far I get. Hopefully, just other people pick the stuff up, and I'm hoping somebody
You know,
figures
I
out live view for Flex.
right. I mean, talking about prototyping, right? Like that's definitely what Rails is great at,
Yeah,
and what I've loved about it. But it is like it would be even better if you had like some kind of view component structure where you could just drag and drop all these shared resources and like build out your
yeah,
forms or whatever that you're building, and then be like, all right, I want to hook this up to something, right?
yeah,
And then it you could be able to configure or drag and drop things to connect them and have it automatically build models. Like I feel like all this
yeah.
stuff is like possible.
It
And
is.
as like
Yeah,
a and as a
yeah,
prototyping tool, like I guess there's like some sites already out there doing it, but like it seems easy enough with all the tools we already have in Rails to be able to do that.
yeah, yeah,
Uh, and I'm kind of surprised it hasn't surfaced yet, to be honest.
yeah,
For
Th-
it being such a hey, this is a prototyping tool, like this is
yeah,
the prototyping tool. You want to build a SaaS product that's as successful as GitHub or Shopify,
yeah,
right? Like this is it, and
yeah,
it can't do what we already know is possible.
yeah, yeah. I still run into people who swear Rails is the most productive framework. A lot of other frameworks have caught up. So there's also a conversation around like, oh, not enough new people are coming into Rails. And I wonder if those two things are related. I think it's more nuanced than that, but my mind wanders there. It's like, how could Rails just be made easier and more accessible so that kind of the next generation of companies and startups want to use it? So yeah, I think to your point, I do think there's a lot more that could be done around building the application inside the browser. And there's like tiny hints of that. The run migration button is kind of the first foray into um, modify things on your workstation project directory. Um,
Right.
I've thought about in SitePress, like if I have a SitePress Pro product, it would probably be some kind of web-based interface so that a non-technical marketing person could just edit the files and it would like push it up to GitHub and trigger off a CI kind of process to deploy it. So yeah, I don't know, like maybe that's an open source thing that Rails kind of kicks out. I do think that would probably go a longer way than like improving documentation. There's so much stuff I see in documentation where like that should really be automated. Um,
Yeah.
it would just save thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hours across humanity if these like things were just simpler to do and had kind of a default answer. But yeah, there's a lot about Rails that um, it's just kind of left to the end user to figure out. Where I think there could be stronger opinions that could kind of give it back that being productive, competitively productive with other frameworks out there today. Um, I do think Rails is a great web framework. Active Record is great. Um, the router is great. The controllers are great. The view layer could use just a lot of improvements. And asset management is a mess. Like if asset management had one answer and one opinion, um, and we can get to a world where we have kind of a standard library of view components, I think we see some really interesting things happening on the Rails front end. Um, and then, yeah, I think for beginners, it'd be nice just to have more kind of tooling built into the Rails runtime and you hit errors or whatever. There's signs of that happening.
Yeah. I mean, it would even be nice to have it on that landing page, like, "Hey, generate a new model with this command," right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
or
I
whatever would be our scaffold, right? Like,
I tried. I will say I opened a there's a PR, maybe
okay.
you'll see. I opened the PR, I had that, and then it got shut down. Um, I
What was
tried
the
it.
what was the feedback for that?
It's I can't remember exactly. It was something like we can't DHH said something to the effect of, "We can't expect to teach, like, Rails in the screen." And that's not the intent. So I tried to counter that with, um, what we need in Rails are better road signs. It's like if you get in a car and you drive somewhere, you don't wanna see 100 signs all at once. I agree that's a terrible experience.
Right.
But the what I would say that Rails could use more of is just like better road signs. So whenever you do fire up that welcome screen, why not have it tell you what to do next? Like, hey, go edit your routes file. Here's the path. Um,
Right.
Generate a scaffold or something. Which I know I went with your routes files here. Open that because there's a comment in the top of the routes file that says like, hey, here's what you should do next. So I
Right.
believe in having those road signs and little hints in a way that doesn't overwhelm. You don't want to have like 6 signs or 3 signs or something like that. Ideally, it's just kind of sending people in one direction who are new, and then people who have like used it over and over again, they just don't even pay attention to it anymore, and it stays kind of out of their way. Um, but anyway, like I had to rip that out. I don't know why. I know others have tried to improve the Rails home screen. It doesn't work for whatever reason. Um, Maybe it's a design masterpiece or something. I have no idea, but um, there's a lot of room for improvement there as well. I even think that maybe we're getting to a point where Rails is just a mature web framework, and maybe uh, our energy as an open source community could be spent kind of building a framework on top of Rails. And we see that in some SaaS starter kits, like um, was it Bullet
Bullet train.
Train? Yeah, and then what is the other one? Is it Go Rails?
Go Rails
Yeah,
or Jumpstart Rails.
that's it. Jumpstart Rails.
Yeah.
They're kind of looking at that, um, and I like to think that that's kind of the next generation of framework. Is like Rails is a solid web framework. They solve some kind of fundamental web problems. Um, but if you want to build kind of a CRUD application, there is a layer on top of that that um, could be helpful, and maybe that layer too would include more road signage and more of these tools that automate some of these things that are just so manual inside of Rails. So it'd be cool to see that and see a framework that's just highly, highly opinionated. I'm actually thinking of combining some of the things that I've talked about, both the content and the view components, into this framework that right now I'm thinking about just calling it Monolith. So I have used Monolith to deploy Monolith. So it's rubymonolith.com. I have like this landing page right now it's kind of out of date. But the idea there is like, all right, let's combine this world of component driven development with content out of the box. And you type monolith new, you get all this stuff. And going back to kind of the different phases of development that I talk about, the phase one, I think, is like, oh, here's a landing page, like get that deployed. And then phase two would be prototyping. So you're just kind of essentially laying out the scaffolding, but not with a bunch of files. You're doing it with like inline view components and controllers. You get your prototype out there, get a couple users, and then kind of the next phase after that is integrating stuff like Stripe to get payment, kind of getting things ready for production. I think it'd be pretty interesting to build kind of a framework around those 3 different ideas of component driven development, content as a first class citizen, and then instead of
Right.
throwing like 20 features on somebody once, like how can you break it out into phases where you can say, hey, for this framework, just focus about creating the landing page, explaining what it is that you're going to build, ship that, and then once you do that, then prototype the thing, and it opens up a new kind of level of plugins and documentation,
Like
all
a
that stuff.
Rails guide's guide.
Yeah, kind of. It's like some road signage, some better road signage, if you
Better
will.
road signage.
Yeah. Uh, and I've thought, like, do you build it on top of Rails or not? And like, there's some good reasons to not build it on Rails. If you want, uh, like, if you want to build on more cutting edge stuff in Ruby, like Raptors or threads, not threads, fibers, um, you probably don't want to build it in Rails yet. But Rails is such a giant, and there's so much already built on it. Like,
Yeah.
I think it makes sense to start thinking of Rails as kind of this mature web framework, and ask the question, like, what can we build on top of that, that kind of gives back that the highly opinionated thing that Rails, I think, had more of back in the day when there were less opinions. It had like one stronger opinion. I think that can be regained through a project like that. So we'll see. I know componentizing everything, especially in Ruby, is not going to make everybody happy, but it
Enough
can
with the
work side by side.
microservices already.
Yeah, yeah. I fell for spas, but not microservices.
Yeah, there's no escaping spas. Uh,
Yeah,
anytime soon, anyway.
yeah,
Um, okay, I mean, I like your idea. I mean, it definitely makes sense having because you're right. Rails is a very mature framework, right? And at
yeah,
this point, making any changes to those fundamentals is going to be harder and harder.
yeah,
So another layer does make a lot of sense, right?
yeah,
Um, so yeah, it'll be interesting to see what comes from. I mean, I would love to read an article on that for sure.
yeah. I'm
uh,
the hints are all there. Anything I write is kind of working up to this. Assuming like I can prove out some of these smaller concepts. Um, but so far it's promising. The view component stuff is 100% doable. I'm right now. I'm trying to figure out how to make batch resource manipulation easier, using some controller hacks that I wrote about recently. So we'll see how far I get with that. I think that's another. In my mind, if you can solve batch resource manipulation, you've you've made a lot of other SaaS uh, Rails SaaS companies happy. It's like, oh, I can just plug this into my Rails application and it works in a sane way. And it's not a ton of hacks.
it reminds me. Somebody posted recently on a Twitter thread about what was it, active resource?
Oh yeah, it's like your OG. If
You're-
I remember that. Huh.
Yeah, I mean, for those that don't know, there was this gem called Active Resource
Yeah,
that did a lot of what Brad was describing in some ways, right? Um, where it lets you manage, the entire CRUD portion of something
yeah,
in a centralized location. And needless to say, it ended up causing a lot of problems the
yeah,
longer you had to work with it.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I have many admin panels where they're still running active
they're
resource.
still running.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, I don't want to go in and clean that up.
Right.
Yeah, there's still a lot of. I want to get to that point where I have something that's like active resource, but it needs to be composable. Um, View component solves that. Another thing of boilerplate that I see constantly is like loading data. Um, I have a gem I'm working on. I actually don't know what the gem is yet. I just kind of push everything to it. It's called Oxidizer. And a problem I solved in there recently was loading data. So I have this like at the top of a controller, you can just say assign posts through blog from current user. And it assembles this nested hierarchy that makes sense from like the point of a nested resource. It kind of forces resources to be one level deep. So I feel pretty good about that, though there's some things I want to change about it so that it works better outside of active record and can work with classes. The thing I'm struggling with though is how can you um, deal with like the update and the create methods in a controller in a way that's composable and not necessarily using inheritance from another controller, or like in the case of active resource, that just includes all this stuff that you find out about later when you don't want it there. uh, so there's some interesting things there that apply to, like, if you're loading a nested resource, a nested singular resource, there's certain ways you want that to behave. If you're doing like batch resource manipulation, there's an entirely different way you want that to behave. But those behaviors are pretty common for whatever it is that you're trying to do. And
Right.
I see that just over again in controllers implemented, which isn't terrible. There's something nice about seeing how the code is loaded. But I think we can do better. And I've been working on that. Like, how can we load data in a sane way for most use cases? And then again, if the abstraction is leaky, like, just drop back into your before actions. But I am trying to figure out how to make the update and save kind of flows that we see over and over again, like um, assigning the attributes, permitting them. Like, how can all that boilerplate be
Right.
abstracted away in a way where if it leaks, it's easy to drop down into that. I haven't figured that out yet. I've tried many times, but I end up in something that looks kind of like active resource for admin
Yep.
panels. I have a few more ideas I'm going to try. We'll see what happens. Hopefully I can get there. I think between batch and a few other things I'm doing, like, maybe I'll figure it out. Maybe I won't, but I'll die trying.
I mean, I think that you make a good point, how easy it is to experiment within Rails, right?
Yeah,
That the framework is so mature now, like, it's pretty easy to find what you need, where it is, how it works.
yeah,
And I guess adding more abstractions only hides it further, which
yeah,
maybe is a bad idea. And I know that's the common argument, right?
yeah,
But for prototyping, back to our,
yeah,
the layer, it definitely makes a lot of sense, right? Cover it
yeah,
up and do as quick as you can, move as quick as you can, until you don't need to anymore.
yeah. Yeah, good abstractions stay out of the way, and then when they don't work, they're easy to drop down a level and fix the leak. But there's just so many things that have been shipped, and I've shipped a lot of these that they seem great at the time, and then only later on you realize, like, oh, that was the wrong choice.
I made a huge mistake.
Yeah, yeah. It's gonna be hard to undo that. Uh, but yeah, there's abstractions are always trade-offs. Like, I won't pretend that it's not. There's things to like about abstractions, and there's things to not, which is
That's
why, like,
and
it's applicable to,
we need a new layer on top of that too for
yeah.
refactoring and transitioning to a new.
That's all going to be GPT. Like, we don't have to worry about
Right.
that. GPT
That's true.
6 is. I wonder about that
It's all
sometimes.
just gonna
Like,
be comments with prompts,
yeah, yeah.
There.
I I've thought about that to the point where I realized that, assuming that I don't like calling it AI. Let's get large language models, assuming that they're like on our side and helping us. They're going to want to write things that we want to read. So I have a hard time seeing a world where we humans want to read just code that's tangled up that we don't understand. So I'm optimistic that LLMs are going to be writing like code that's easy for us to look at and understand, and hopefully refactor some things. Like, if there's an abstraction that we need to go a little deeper, maybe it could explain it in a way where it makes sense, or maybe it could refactor the abstraction out. I could see it doing that. Um, but I have a hard time seeing a world where we're just like throwing spaghetti code into this thing and somehow it all like stitches it together and works. But we'll see. It's hard to predict what's going on there. There's days where I'm like, GPT is so great at coding. Like, I built some ZHS, ZSH extensions. I know nothing about shell scripting, and it did that. But then sometimes, if I'm asking GPT like some kind of specific question, it'll give me a confident answer that I'm like, ooh,
Yeah.
that sounds believable, and it doesn't work.
Which is kind of funny because, the more specific you get, the worse it gets.
Yeah, yeah,
Which is like, it's a large language model for more
yeah,
generic terms.
yeah. I
I
don't.
guess, right? Like,
I'm curious how the larger token sizes work, because we have, like, I think the public preview is 8,000 tokens. I don't really
yep.
know what that means. Like, what is a token? It's a word. Um,
kind of.
yeah. And then
So
the other,
sometimes they break it down where they have like every character is a token in a
yeah,
word, depending on it.
yeah, you
It's
see the
like not
tokenizers.
it's not straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing I'd like to understand is using a 32,000 token GPT-4, is that going from 8,000 to 32,000, is that a linear increase in ability, or is it like an exponential increase? I don't know. I'm sure like people who are in the space, it's probably a really easy question for them to answer. But it'll be interesting to see what happens as the token size increases. It'd be cool just to throw your whole GitHub repo in there and it understands it, and then you can just tell it to do things and it gives you some answers. And then I guess
Right.
add to that the ability to like operate a REPL so it can try the stuff that it tells you to make sure the obvious stuff that it pretends to know that
I
doesn't
you
actually
know,
run works.
I wouldn't be surprised if Replit or one of these other
Hmm.
sites
Yeah.
has this, you know.
Yeah.
I bet they do.
I'm sure GitHub's all over it. Like they're owned
Oh
by
yeah.
Microsoft. OpenAI is owned by Microsoft. Um, that was such a great acquisition by Microsoft. Like they
Do you
bought their
think they had
relevancy.
any idea?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think at the time before they bought GitHub, they had like Visual Studio. I forget if VS Code was a thing, but it was just kind of Microsoft wasn't perceived as, I don't want to say they were irrelevant in open source, but it wasn't, they weren't at the center of it. And buying GitHub, it's like, hey, we're going to be around for decades. and a lot of major projects are going to be hosted on here. So I think I think they knew what they're doing. I don't know to what degree of success they knew that would be, but um, yeah, for Microsoft, I think that was a great acquisition. I don't know what that means for open source, especially with like OpenAI kind of coming into the mix and seeing what's going on there. I know there's been controversy around like, was it Copilot training itself on open source? Um, and I've seen, I don't know if this is true or not, but like proprietary code has been emitted from these models. Um, I don't know how common that is or if that's even true, but um, there's still some things to that. Like, there's no doubt that these models are consuming things that are proprietary. Maybe it doesn't know it, but it consumes those things and spits them out. So it's interesting. We're on the cusp of another kind of interesting push, and it seems like there's gonna be some like real stuff coming out of this. It's gonna be helpful. I'm mostly optimistic about it. Um,
I'm with you.
yeah,
I see it as a great tool. And I mean, the more we can get past all of the, you know, is it ethical or is it stealing X or
yeah,
if everybody's using it, does it matter?
yeah,
It's almost like at this point, the Mickey is about to be released, right? And copyright and like so what, everybody's allowed to just make their own Mickey toys and sell them, right? Like
yeah, yeah.
there
We'll see
it's
Mid
almost like
Journey.
there's no rules. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mitch,
Mid, it'll just be cranking out Mickey Mouse
right.
flicks. Like, what Disney movie do you want to watch with Mickey Mouse? And it'll put the whole things together with voices and stuff.
Well,
Yeah,
we've talked about a lot. We
yeah,
should move to picks here. It's been an awesome talk. It's been great to have you on, Brad.
yeah.
Uh, do you have anything you want to share? Picks is a segment. You just pick anything you're thinking about working on, purchases, anything you want to share, really.
Yeah, geez, purchases. We could talk more about Flex. Check Flex out. Um, get past the uncomfort it brings. That's kind of obvious though, but flex.fun is the website for that. I'll go into something fun that if you live in an area where there's nice weather, you should have an outdoor desk. So I, in the winter, I'm like, I want a desk that's outside. So I bought one of those like Husky desks from Home Depot that has like the little handle that you can put up and down. So you get that. That's kind of the obvious thing. Get a stool, buy a barbecue cover because you're going to put it over that, and then get a monitor arm and put a display on there and like cable the thing up, clamp it on there, hook your microphone and stuff up to it, and just have that thing outside. So when it's nice outside, you can sit out there and use your desk, stand up, sit down. When you're done with it, you just cover it and wheel it off to the side, and it looks like a barbecue is hanging out there. But that's kind of fun. I have mine sitting kind of on the front patio, and whenever a delivery person comes by, they're kind of freaked out because there's just this person sitting over there in the corner in this desk. And I looked like the receptionist or something. I'm like, can I help you? And I got my little keyboard there. Like, what is this person doing? Um, but yeah, check that out if you want to get outside. Um, put the desk together, and you'll enjoy that. uh,
That's a great idea. I'd never thought about that. The
yeah,
barbecue cover.
it works. It's rained for like 4 months. I live in Northern California, and I had the thing outside just under 4 months of rain, and it's dry. It worked fine. My what is it? The USB-C Thunderbolt cable or whatever corroded, but I solved that. You do want to make sure everything's waterproof. And Amazon's your friend there for all the little rubber fittings. But yeah, having an outdoor desk is a great thing.
Awesome. My latest addition to my office is maybe you can't see it from here, but it's this
Yeah.
laser engraver in the background.
Ooh, nice. Yeah.
I was one of those suckers that saw a Indiegogo campaign and was like, oh, I'm gonna, this looks really cool. It's a 20-watt laser, and it sits on my desk and it detaches so I can bring it around and carry it and like laser engrave the wall. And I'm just having like way too much fun with this thing.
Yeah.
But it's
That'd be
by
fun.
ComMaker, and yeah, I mean the first day you get it and it has like you can engrave images even, and you just like sit it and put on your goggles and watch it etch into metal, and it's incredible.
Yeah.
It's way too much fun.
That'd be fun. Yeah. I have like too much stuff in the garage like that. No laser engraver, but it'd be fun to have that.
Yeah,
Hmm.
we'll see. I mean, I've got a backlog of projects that I just like I'm gonna start
Yeah.
like running through, and it's gonna be so much fun.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Uh, all right, well, it's great having you on, Brad.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
You know, I'm looking forward to reading more of your content. Your fly articles are really fly.
Yeah.
You make a lot of great points, and you're tackling all the right problems. It seems. I hope that something fruitful comes from it, and I'm going to definitely try and use some of the ideas you got there for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's the content's definitely I'll be cranking a lot of that out, and we'll see how far I get. But I don't know, hopefully I come out on the other side of this with a compelling framework that kind of makes Rails just that much more productive. Um, but we'll see. A lot of interesting ideas there, and I'm sure some won't work out, but hopefully some do.
Yeah, I mean, for all our case, I hope they do.
Yeah, yeah. We could use a better view layer and definitely better asset management.
All right, well, until next time, folks. Valentino out.